Welcome, everyone, to the G Note Podcast. I am your host, Jason Spicy G. Goldman, and I'm a Grammy-winning record producer, arranger, and musician. I've been a music professor at USC for over 22 years, and I am most known for writing and producing music for the iconic crooner Michael Bublé over the past 2 decades. This is a podcast for musicians who want advice and strategies on navigating the music industry. If you're not a musician but a music fan, I promise there is plenty in here for you as well. On this pod, we talk all things music. On today's pod, we are talking about another experience I had with the legendary producer, David Foster. Let's go. All right, welcome back, everyone. Today, I'm going to be talking about another experience I had with the legendary producer, David Foster. If you are interested in hearing a couple of the other experiences I've had with him, please check out some of the episodes a while back, some of the earlier episodes. I talk about some of my first breaks with David. But this one is a really cool story, and it's got a good lesson in it, so I figured I'd share it with everyone. Okay, so as I mentioned in one of my previous stories, I was on tour with Michael Bublé, and I was on tour with him for a little over a year. And towards the end of that time, David and Michael began working on Michael's second studio album, which ended up being called, I think it's called It's Time. Michael was always super cool and invited me to a lot of the sessions to watch the process and possibly work on the album. But I think a lot of artists do this too. You know, you see this a lot where they bring their friends with them to the studio and it makes them feel more comfortable. It's more like, you know, you're hanging out and it's just a comfort level thing. But for me, obviously, Michael knew that I was an arranger because I had already written some things for him on the road. And so I'm not saying that he was like, oh, Jason will, get to work with David, as much as it was like, hey, check out this process. I'd love to just have you around. So David, and if you don't know David Foster, again, he's one of the biggest producers of all time. Produced Celine Dion, Whitney Houston, Chicago, was on the Thriller record. I mean, iconic. And more importantly to this story, he founded and signed Michael Bublé to Reprise Records. At the time, I lived in South Pasadena. And at that time, I would have to drive to get to David's studio, which was actually, he had a studio built on his insanely big property, which is amazing. So I'd have to drive almost an hour and a half to get to David's house, which was in Malibu at the time. And, it was a small price to pay to work, obviously, with one of the greatest producers ever. And I say work, but more importantly, just watch and be around one of the greatest ever. So just again, to be clear, I was watching and hoping more than anything. I was really hoping. This was David's artist and he was the producer and producing. And at that point, I had never produced anyone at all. So again, many times I would go over, we'd hang out, maybe we'd play some tennis or talk music. I'd listen to some stories. And it was just incredible just to hang out in that. People see those kinds of things in documentaries, and it was just really cool to do it. One of the things that happened at these sessions often was trying to figure out songs that David and Michael wanted to put on the album. At this time, which again was pre-originals, right? This is before the song Home came out. This is when Michael was still doing mostly crooner American songbook tunes. So David's vision for Michael, if you aren't clear, David's vision for Michael was that he was going to be the modern day Sinatra. He was the next crooner. And David had a formula. And actually, this turns out to be the formula that he basically still used for him on the last record that we did, which was Love. And the last record, I think, that David he said that was going to be the last record he produced. But to this day, the Bublé camp still uses pretty much the same formula. even though many times, Bublé will say that he wants to do something different or everyone talks about doing something different, it always comes down to the same formula, which is roughly 2 to 3 big band songs, 2 to 3 ballads, 1 to 2 Latin type songs, 2 to 3 modern songs done in a crooner style, right? Like, for example, like George Michael's song, Kissing a Fool. We took that song from, the George Michael style and moved it over to this more crooner-esque type style. So, just as an example, the big band songs are, like something like Come Fly With Me or I've Got You Under My Skin. The ballads would be something like That's All or You Never Know. The Latin songs, obviously, he's super famous for singing Sway and it Had Better Be Tonight. And again, the modern songs, I just gave you the idea of, Kissing a Fool, which again was a George Michael song, or Moon Dance, which is a Van Morrison song. And so you get the picture. In order to make like a 10 to 12 song album, you really want about 15, to cut about 15 songs so that you have some for bonus tracks and special editions. So just keep that in mind because, again, you're really recording 15 songs, and this was again back in the day. Nowadays, it's like you can release a record with like 6 to 7 songs, even though that's basically an EP. You could still call that an album, but I digress. So I would be there watching Bublé, cut vocals on a song or watching David create a demo, which he often does on, one of his keyboards. And I mentioned that in one of the other episodes, but that's how David likes to, work really. He creates these MIDI, they call them, we call them mock-ups. So he plays everything in with quick patches. He has an engineer there in the studio. The engineer will switch the sounds for him and he plays everything in on the keyboard, strings, horns, fake horns, everything. And then he'll give it to an arranger to make it sound, real and live. For those that don't know, MIDI to the layperson are basically, again, synthesized instruments. They're not real instruments. So David would play the form of the song on the piano, lay down all the parts to the instruments, and he, like I said, meant he needed someone to arrange the song. Uh, it's not that he couldn't do some of it, but especially when it came to like big band and strings, I don't even know if he can actually arrange those for that instrumentation. But a better thing that makes him an iconic producer is that he knows what he can do and when he needs help. And so, as the producer, of course, he wanted to get people who are great at those things. So, just as a side note, and this is kind of some inside information, a typical budget for someone like a Bublé would be roughly about $1 million to make a record. It used to be more, but now for most artists, it's probably under $1 million. Especially because aside from what Bublé does and some other, maybe acoustic-y sounding things, rock bands or something, you can make it all in a small little bedroom, as you've heard with Billie Eilish. So, anyways, one day we were at the studio and David was working on an American songbook song called "Beginning to See the Light," which is an old Duke Ellington standard. And he wanted it to be for big band, and so he basically finished laying down the demo on his synthesizer. Now, the demo is important as it gives the arranger the right key and specific ideas that the producer and the artist have. And David is pretty particular about what he wants in terms of making sure that whatever he's got down should be on there. And then you make sure that that's in there and you enhance it. So we're all sitting there and David says, okay, who are we going to give this big band chart to arrange? And he had already asked the great John Clayton to do a couple of charts already. John's one of the best in the world, and a friend. But he had one more for another arranger. So enter me, Spicy G. Mind you, I barely spoke at these sessions, right? I already mentioned it's typical for artists to have their crew around them when they're making an album. But I didn't want to overstep my bounds because, again, there's very few in music that ever will get to the level of David. So David says, let's give this arrangement to Bill Holman. or this song to Bill Holman to arrange, who is a fantastic arranger, by the way. I say, he's literally one of the best that ever lived, for sure. So I say to David, again, I don't really open my mouth much, but I say, "Hey, I can do it." And he looks at me and just kind of chuckles. And I say, "Look, I can write a better chart than Bill." And he just laughs. I was also thinking to myself, why did I just say that? you know, it's it's just a weird thing to say, but when you're trying to get the gig, you need to say sometimes some things that will make someone be like, "What?" So I said to David, I said, "Look, I'm serious. I can write a better chart." And he looked at me and said, "This one is going to Bill Holman." Done. That was it. So after that forceful sentence by David, Bublé jumps in and says, "David, look, I really want this album to swing." I'm laughing because, again, at that time, a lot of Bublé stuff was like swinging stuff, right? So Foster, of course, says, "What does that mean?" And Bublé says, "Look, man, my last album just felt stiff and I didn't really feel like it swung." And then Bublé looks at me and he says, "Right, Jay?" And of course, um, you know, I had one of those instant hot flashes, like immediately, and I started like sweating. I was like, "Oh my God." And where your temperature goes up like 10 degrees, like in an instant. And Bublé, first of all, Bublé says this because me and a bunch of the band guys on the tour bus told him that, it wasn't really swinging. I mean, we literally said that. Studio guys don't swing the same way as like a band a lot of times. They just don't. I mean, the feel, it's swinging, the rhythm is still swaying, but the feel's just not the same. So there I am, and I say, well, Mike, everyone has their own opinion on that. I'm now I'm now in holy God. Why would Bublé throw me under the bus like this mode? I was just completely at a loss. So I had to come up with that answer. And Bublé says, "Come on, Jay, tell him what you told me on the bus." And of course, now I'm just like, oh no. And David's just staring at me with this look like he's daring me to say anything so he could have a reason to knock me out. That's what it looked like to me. I finally get the nerve up because I can't lie. I just can't lie. First of all, that would seem weak, and and it's just not me. So I say, "Well, in my opinion, it wasn't that swinging." And then I quickly go, "But everyone has their own opinion." So David fires back at me and says, quote, "What the fuck do you know? How many Grammys do you have?" To which I simply say, "Point taken." And I wanted this guy, obviously I wanted this conversation to end immediately. And I just shut up the rest of the time. And I just couldn't believe it. I just sat there like with this, feeling inside, like, I cannot believe that just happened. Anyways, I mean, it really was like one of those things that I will never forget. Moving on. Before leaving that day, though, the engineer was kind enough to give me a copy of David's demo. Obviously, because I asked. Now, if you heard one of my earlier Foster episodes, you know what I did next. I went home and I wrote a chart on the song. I was convinced I could write a better chart. So once again, no pay guaranteed. I wasn't asked to do it, and a very slim chance of it getting recorded, period. So after that session, I really didn't hear much from the Bublé camp for about a month, until finally Bublé had texted me that they were going into the studio to do a big band session. And they were going to do some of John Clayton's charts, and then Don Sebesky, who's also another great arranger, and Bill Holman's chart. The session, literally, when he called me, he told me this. I was like, "Oh, okay, cool." And then he's like, "Okay, yeah, the session starts in an hour." So, of course, I'm like, "What?" So I canceled everything that I had the rest of the day. Private lessons, some teaching at the arts high school. I grabbed my chart, got to the studio in record time. Right? I had my chart and the score and the parts in my hand. So I go into the control room and I see David and he says, "Hey, what's up?" And I said, "Hey, hi." And I said, "Hey, David, I know you already got Bill to do the chart on Beginning to See the Light, but I brought my chart in case there was time." And he looked at me and he scoffed and he said, "Maybe if we have time at the end," and just kind of like looked away and really didn't acknowledge it after that. So the session's going, it's going, had some hiccups like most sessions do, but they get through 3 of the charts and they record Bill's chart on Beginning to See the Light. And it was solid. There's no surprise. But to be honest with you, I actually felt even more sure that mine was better after hearing it. Again, I'm not knocking Bill's chart at all, but I just felt mine was just a little bit more attention to detail. So they do a couple of takes of the chart, and David seems to like, Bill's chart. And guess what? Lo and behold, there's 15 minutes left in the session. They got done early. So David turns to me and says, "Look, this face, like stone cold face. You have 15 minutes and not 1 second over. I am not going to pay for overtime for 17 musicians. You hear me?" I obviously grabbed my chart, ran into the studio, right? Into the actual recording room. So this basically means I have time to do 1 take of the chart. Literally, just get 1 down. So I'm super nervous, of course, and I could see Bublé with his hopeful grin just kind of watching. He didn't say anything the entire session. Again, David was the boss. We all kind of just sat there. But so I ran out, passed out my parts really quickly to all the band members. And I give the band 1 or 2 quick notes, because I'm watching my watch and I'm down to like 7 or 8 minutes. And I count it off and away we go. And when the last note ended, it was just silent. And David is staring at me from the control booth, and the engineer had turned the mic on, the talkback mic, the mic on in the control room, which is where the producer and everyone is sitting, by accident. And I hear David say, after a good 10-second pause where no one said anything, he goes, "The little shit did it." He says to everyone, "Okay, everyone, we're going to do another couple of takes and do overtime." And I was just in awe. Mike comes running out. He gives me a hug and says, "I knew it, man." And it was just one of those moments to me where like I knew I could hang with the big writers. And it was, again, one of these things where David didn't have to give me this opportunity, but he did. And it was special to me. I don't think he thought twice about it, but to me it was special, the fact that he saw that that I did something and I put in the effort and he was willing to let me play it, because that session alone, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars. Well, guess what? The song never actually made it onto the album. And it is in some vault or some hard drive somewhere. But this was an important moment in my career. It was the first time, like I said, I felt that I was at the level. If you listen to this pod a lot, you know that I'm always talking about the highest level. And I felt that I was there, or at least was real freaking close and I could hang. So while this would be the second time I would prove myself to David, the first being one of those stories I told earlier in the podcast, it would take me over a decade since that to finally earn his complete trust. But what it did was prove to Michael that I was at the level, and of course myself, that I could hang with some of the greatest writers. And this is a similar lesson from last season, but you have to be willing to go to the end of the earth to get what you want. And the best motivator is yourself. And some friendly competition with people at the highest level, of course. Again, it's not that I was trying to compete with Bill Holman. This was probably just some quick job to Bill Holman, right? He's written for the best of the best. He was probably like, "Yeah, I'll do this chart. charged his whatever, 8 to 10 grand, and then they called it a day. But for me, right, I was young, I was hungry, and I wanted to prove to myself and everyone that I was worthy of being in this room and worthy of my music being on albums that had Michael Bublé and David Foster's name on it. So to all of you out there looking for a break, find the challenge. Like I always say, look for the opportunities. Take them while they're there, because there are very few opportunities. Take the challenge and beat expectations and rise to the highest level. Folks, that is it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this pod so you can stay up to date with new shows, giveaways, and more importantly, the concerts. Everyone, you got to come out and check out my big band. It is a blast. You will love it, I promise. We play at Vibrato almost every 2-3 months, so you can check their calendar out. You can also follow me on Instagram at SpicyGMusic, or check out my website, jasongoldmanmusic.com, to see what projects I'm currently working on and to see when I'll be performing next. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. Much love. Peace.